The consommé was too salty. It was a subtle error, perhaps only 3 grams of extra sea salt in a 50-gallon drum of bone broth, but to me, it tasted like a scream. I watched from the darkened service alcove as 200 of New York's elite lifted their silver spoons, swallowed the golden liquid, and closed their eyes in performative ecstasy. They were mourning Chef Auguste, my late husband, and the supposed god of flavor. But they were eating a lie prepared by a nervous line cook who had rushed the reduction. They praised the clarity of the soup, unaware that the true architect of that recipe was standing 10 feet away, holding a tray of dirty napkins, invisible in plain sight. Hello, everyone. I am Tina. Today I bring you a story that will challenge everything you think you know about family loyalty. Stay with me until the very end to understand why silence is sometimes the loudest weapon. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss these journeys of truth. It was the 14th of October, a Tuesday, and the rain had been hammering against the stained glass windows of the banquet hall since dawn. We were burying Auguste, but really, we were burying the last shred of truth in this family. I, Elise, had spent 40 years standing over the burners, while Auguste stood in front of the cameras. I was the hands, he was the face. It was an arrangement that worked when we were young and hungry in 1982. But tonight, staring at the polished mahogany of his casket, the arrangement felt like a cage. I adjusted my black dress. It was simple, bought off the rack, contrasting sharply with the sea of couture surrounding me. I had intended to sit in the front row, but my son Julian had intercepted me 20 minutes before the doors opened. Julian looked polished, sharp, and entirely unfamiliar. He wore a suit that cost more than my first house. Beside him stood my 2 grandchildren, Bella and Leo, both in their early 20s, looking at their phones, bored by the grief surrounding them. "Please, Mom," Julian had whispered, guiding me firmly toward the kitchen entrance. "Let us handle the front of house. You know how emotional you get. Plus, the investors are here. We need to project strength and modernity. You look a bit tired." Then Bella, my granddaughter, had chimed in without looking up from her screen. "Yeah, Grandma. You smell like onions and mothballs. It is kind of embarrassing. Just stay in the back, okay? We do not want people thinking we cannot afford staff." So I stayed in the back. I stood in the shadow of the swinging kitchen doors, watching my family accept condolences for a man they hardly knew. Auguste had been a brilliant showman, but an absent father and a difficult husband. The culinary world mourned a genius. I mourned the years I spent correcting his seasoning while he took the bows. The dinner service moved to the main course. Roast duck with cherry gastrique. I could smell the sauce from here. It lacked the star anise I always insisted on. My heart ached, not for the dead, but for the food. It was losing its soul, plate by plate. Julian tapped a crystal glass with a silver knife. The room fell silent. He stepped up to the podium, placing a hand on the casket as if drawing power from it. He looked the part of the grieving son perfectly, a single tear glistening on his cheek under the spotlight. "Thank you all for coming to honor the legacy of Chef Auguste," Julian began, his voice smooth and practiced. "My father was a purist. He believed in the singular experience of a meal. But tonight, I am here to tell you that his legacy will not just survive, it will multiply." I stiffened. We had never discussed business plans. The will was still in probate. Julian gestured to a screen descending behind the altar. A logo appeared. It was Auguste's signature, digitized and sleek, stamped over a map of the world. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight I announce the August Standard," Julian proclaimed, his sadness evaporating into corporate ambition. "We are launching a franchise model. 50 cities, 50 locations, 1 standard. We have developed a proprietary method to freeze and ship our signature bases, ensuring that a customer in Dubai tastes the exact same consommé as a customer in London. No more reliance on temperamental chefs. We are automating the genius." A murmur of excitement rippled through the investors in the crowd. My blood ran cold. He was not just selling the name, he was erasing the craft. He was talking about freezing the soul of our work and shipping it in cardboard boxes. Bella and Leo were clapping enthusiastically in the front row, beaming at their father. They saw dollar signs. They saw an inheritance that would fund their lifestyles without them ever having to touch a hot stove. I looked at my hands, scarred from decades of burns and cuts, the hands that had actually built this empire. They wanted to automate me. They wanted to turn my life's work into a microwave dinner and call it luxury. Julian continued, smiling broadly now. And the best part? We move forward starting tomorrow. The old ways die with my father. The room erupted in applause. I felt a heavy, cold stone settle in my stomach. It was not anger. It was something deeper, more final. They thought I was just an embarrassing old woman who smelled of onions. They had forgotten that I was the only one who knew the recipes. I turned away from the door, letting it swing shut, cutting off the sound of their applause. I walked past the line cooks who were too busy plating mediocre duck to notice me. I walked out the back exit into the rainy alleyway. The cold rain felt good on my flushed face. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. It was tattered, held together by rubber bands, stained with oil and saffron. It contained the real ratios, the secret techniques, the adjustments for humidity and season. It was the only copy in existence. Julian thought he had the intellectual property. He thought he owned the flavor, but he had never bothered to learn how to make the stock. I looked at the dumpster near the loading dock. It was empty, waiting for the night's refuse. This was not going to be a loud fight. There would be no screaming match in the dining room. I was too tired for that, and frankly, too polite. But as I stood there in the rain, clutching the soul of the restaurant in my trembling hand, I realized that silence could be a form of demolition. I did not throw the book away. That would be a waste. Instead, I simply put it back in my bag, buttoned my coat, and began the long walk to the subway station. If they wanted to freeze the food, they were welcome to try. But they were about to find out that without the fire, ice is just water. And I was taking the fire with me. The next morning felt less like a new chapter and more like a sterile autopsy. I arrived at the restaurant at 6 o'clock sharp, a habit ingrained in my bones since 1974. Usually, the air would already be thick with the scent of roasting garlic and simmering veal stock. Today, however, the air smelled of floor wax and ozone. Julian was waiting for me. He stood by the swinging doors that used to lead to the vegetable prep station. Beside him stood Elias, my head chef and loyal friend for over 30 years. Elias looked small, his chef's whites hanging loosely on his frame, his eyes darting around with the confusion of a man who suddenly does not recognize his own home. "Come with me," Julian said. He did not ask. He did not offer a morning greeting. He simply turned on his heel, his Italian leather shoes clicking sharply against the tile. He led us not to the main line, but to the back section of the building, the area where we used to cure our own meats. The heavy wooden door was gone. In its place was a sliding glass panel that hissed open with a motion sensor. "Welcome to the Innovation Lab," Julian announced, spreading his arms as if he had just painted the Sistine Chapel. The room was blindingly white. The butcher block tables were gone, replaced by sleek stainless steel counters that looked more suited for a hospital operating room than a kitchen. There were no knives, no cutting boards, no pots. Instead, rows of computer servers hummed against the far wall, their blue lights blinking in a rhythmic, cold heartbeat. In the center of the room sat a single, strange machine with glass tubes and digital displays. Elias stepped forward, his hand trembling slightly as he touched the cold steel counter. "Where are the stoves?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Julian laughed, a dry sound that lacked any real humor. "Stoves are archaic, Elias. Heat is inconsistent. Fire is unpredictable. This is Project Palette." He tapped a tablet screen, and a large monitor on the wall flickered to life. It showed complex webs of data, swirling lines and numbers. "We have scanned every single one of my father's journals," Julian explained, his eyes reflecting the blue light of the screen. 40 years of handwritten notes. Every recipe, every margin scribble, every adjustment. We fed it all into the algorithm. This machine does not just read recipes, it understands the chemical compound of flavor. It can predict the perfect molecular combination for a bisque better than any human tongue. I felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with illness. He was talking about our life's work as if it were a math problem to be solved. He was reducing the magic of a Sunday dinner to a chemical equation. "But cooking is not about chemistry," I said, speaking for the first time. It is about feeling. It is about knowing that the tomatoes are sweeter in August than they are in June. Julian waved his hand dismissively, as if swatting away a fly. That is the variable we are eliminating, Mother. Sentimentality is inefficient. He turned his focus to Elias. The old man looked broken, staring at the machine that was meant to replace him. Elias, Julian said, his voice taking on a businesslike clip. Your role as executive chef is evolving. We no longer need you on the line. The machine handles the formulation. The franchise locations will receive pre-measured packets based on this data. Elias looked up, hope fading from his eyes. So, you are firing me? No, Julian corrected him smoothly. We are reassigning you. We need you for calibration. The machine is 99% accurate, but it needs a human baseline to verify the data in the initial phase. You will taste what it produces and grade it on a scale of 1 to 10. You will teach it to mimic the soul you are so fond of. Once the algorithm learns your preferences, your contract will be fulfilled. The cruelty of it took my breath away. He was not just firing Elias. He was asking Elias to train his own executioner. He wanted Elias to pour his remaining knowledge into a hard drive so that he could be discarded with a clear conscience. I looked at Elias. I saw the humiliation burning his cheeks. He was a master of his craft, reduced to a data entry point. And what about me? I asked, clutching my purse tighter, feeling the weight of the notebook inside against my hip. Julian glanced at me, his expression softening into something indistinguishable from pity. You, Mother? You can finally retire. Go to Florida. Play bridge. Let the future happen. He turned back to his screens, dismissing us both. He did not know that the future he was building was hollow. He had the data, yes. He had the machines. But as I looked at the sleek, soulless room, I knew something he did not. A machine can copy a recipe, but it cannot taste the love in it. And without the notebook in my purse, his expensive algorithm was learning from incomplete data. Elias looked at me, his eyes wet. I gave him a subtle nod, a silent command to endure it for now. We would play their game. We would let them think they had won, but we would not give them everything. Not yet. I turned and walked out of the white room, leaving the hum of the servers behind me. The decision settled in my chest, heavy and sharp. I would not go to Florida. I would watch this fail, and when it did, I would be the only one left standing with the truth in my hands. The testing phase began on a rainy Tuesday in November. I sat on a high stool in the corner of the renovated test kitchen, my hands folded in my lap, trying to make myself as small as possible. The warm, chaotic bustle of our old kitchen was gone, replaced by the low, rhythmic hum of cooling fans and the click of automated dispensers. Julian called it the calibration period. I called it a slow funeral. Elias stood before a stainless steel counter, looking older than his 62 years. He wore his white chef coat, but it seemed like a costume now, a relic from a time when human hands actually touched the food. Beside him, the sleek black interface of the AI unit displayed a scrolling list of parameters. Today is the duck à l'orange, Julian announced, tapping on his tablet without looking up. The system has analyzed 3,000 variations of the dish from top global reviews. It has synthesized the optimal temperature, acidity, and sweetness ratios. Elias stared at the screen. The machine was not asking him to cook. It was telling him to assemble. It dictated the exact internal temperature of the duck breast to the decimal point. It dispensed a pre-measured amount of sauce that had been mixed in a centrifuge, ensuring that the molecular distribution of the orange essence was mathematically perfect. I watched Elias work. His movements, usually fluid and dance-like, were stiff. He was obeying orders from a box. He seared the duck exactly as the screen commanded, removed it at the precise second the timer beeped, and plated it with the geometric precision of a draftsman. It was beautiful. I had to admit that. The glaze glistened under the harsh laboratory lights like amber glass. The slices of duck were a uniform, blushing pink, identical to one another. Eat, Julian commanded. Elias picked up a fork. He cut a small piece of the meat, swept it through the sauce, and placed it in his mouth. He chewed slowly. I held my breath, waiting for the familiar spark in his eyes, the nod of approval that meant he had created something wonderful. Instead, his chewing slowed. He swallowed with difficulty, then set the fork down with a clatter that echoed in the sterile room. "Well?" Julian asked, impatient. "The sensor data indicates the texture is optimal. It is technically perfect," Elias said, his voice quiet. Julian smiled. "Excellent. We can proceed to—" "But it is dead," Elias interrupted, looking at his nephew with a mix of confusion and horror. Julian's smile vanished. "Excuse me? It tastes like nothing," Elias said, pushing the plate away. "It has the texture of duck. It has the acidity of orange. But there is no conversation between the ingredients. It is sterile. It is culinary taxidermy. It looks like life, but it is just stuffed skin." I felt a pang of pride for Elias, but it was quickly overshadowed by the cold look in Julian's eyes. My son walked over to the counter, picked up a slice of the duck with his fingers, and ate it. He did not savor it. He consumed it like fuel. "You are missing the point, Elias," Julian said, wiping his fingers on a napkin. "You are tasting for a Michelin star. I am tasting for scalability." "Scalability?" Elias repeated the word as if it were a curse. "Yes." Julian leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "Do you know why our expansion failed 5 years ago? Because we could not clone you. The duck was brilliant in the main restaurant, but it was dry in Chicago and too sweet in Seattle. Human error is expensive. This machine eliminates the error, but it eliminates the joy," I whispered. Julian turned to me, his expression flat. "The investors do not care about joy, Mother. They care about consistency. They want to know that a customer in Houston gets exactly the same product as a customer in Boston. They are buying reliability. If the duck is a 7 out of 10, but it is a 7 every single time without fail, that is worth billions. A 10 that fluctuates is a liability." Elias looked at the magnificent, soulless duck on the plate. "So you want me to approve mediocrity?" "I want you to approve the future," Julian corrected. "We are not selling food anymore, Elias. We are selling a system. The franchise owners will not need chefs. They will need technicians to maintain the machines. That is the genius of it. We are removing the labor cost and the ego from the kitchen." The silence that followed was heavy. I saw the realization hit Elias. He had thought he was there to teach the machine to be a chef, but Julian simply wanted him to verify that the machine could produce a product that was passable enough to be mass-produced. Elias looked at me, his eyes pleading for an intervention. I stayed seated, my hand resting on my purse. I could have spoken. I could have screamed that this was an insult to his father's legacy, to every onion I had chopped in 1982, to every drop of sweat we had poured into this business. But I remained silent. Julian interpreted my silence as submission. He interpreted Elias's defeat as compliance. He did not see that by revealing his true intention, he had severed the last thread of loyalty that bound us to him. He was building a kingdom of plastic, convinced that people would not notice the difference between a flower and a photograph of a flower. "Fine," Elias said, his voice hollow. "I will calibrate your machine." "Good," Julian said, checking his watch. "We have 6 more entrees to get through before lunch. Let's move to the beef bourguignon." As the machine whirred to life again, displaying a new set of cold, hard numbers, I made a decision. I would not just watch this fail. I would wait for the moment when the world realized that consistency without soul is just another word for emptiness. And when that moment came, I would be ready. It was 3 days later when Elias walked into the small office at the back of the kitchen. The room still smelled faintly of the pipe tobacco my husband used to smoke, a scent that had lingered in the upholstery for years. Elias did not sit down. He stood before the desk where I was reviewing the supplier invoices, his hands trembling slightly as he placed his folded white apron on the mahogany surface. "I cannot do it," he said softly. The words were heavy with a resignation that broke my heart. I looked up at him, seeing the lines of exhaustion etched deep into his face. He had spent 40 years in this kitchen. He had been the hands that executed Auguste's visions when my husband's own hands grew too shaky to hold a knife. "I understand," I said, reaching out to touch the rough cotton of the apron. "You are a craftsman, Elias, not a data entry clerk." "I will finish the week," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I cannot stand on a stage and tell the world that a machine is better than a human soul. I cannot lie for him." The door to the office opened without a knock. Julian stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a deliberate click. He held a thick manila folder in his hand, tapping it rhythmically against his thigh. "Leaving us so soon?" Julian asked. His tone was light, but his eyes were devoid of humor. Elias straightened his back. "I am resigning, Julian. I will not be part of this deception." Julian sighed, walking past Elias to stand by the window. He looked out at the alleyway where the delivery trucks were idling. "That is unfortunate. Because if you resign, Elias, I will be forced to release the audit I concluded last night." "Audit?" Elias frowned. Julian turned, tossing the folder onto the desk between us. It landed with a heavy thud. It slid across the wood and stopped near my hand. "I went through the books from 2019, Julian said. "Specifically, the discretionary fund. There are some significant irregularities. $50,000 siphoned out over 6 months. Labeled as kitchen maintenance, but wired to a private medical specialist in Zurich. The room went so quiet, I could hear the hum of the refrigerator units through the walls. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I knew exactly what that money was." Elias's face drained of color. He looked at me, then back at Julian. "That was not theft." "It looks like theft," Julian said, shrugging. $50,000 of company money sent to a personal account. That is embezzlement, Elias. That is a felony." "It was for your father," Elias shouted, his composure finally cracking. I froze. Julian did not know. He had been away at business school in London during that terrible year. He did not know that Auguste had suffered a minor stroke that no one noticed, a stroke that had taken the one thing a chef cannot live without, his sense of taste. For 6 months, Auguste had been blind in his own kitchen. He could not taste the salt in the soup or the acid in the vinaigrette. He was terrified the critics would find out, that the empire would crumble. So Elias became his palate. Elias tasted everything, and Elias had used the funds to pay for experimental neurological treatments in Switzerland, desperate to restore Auguste's gift before the world realized the king of cuisine had lost his crown. He had anosmia, Elias whispered, the secret finally spilling into the open air. "Your father could not taste a thing. I paid for his treatments to save his reputation. To save this restaurant." Julian looked at Elias, and for a second, I thought I saw a flicker of surprise, but it was quickly replaced by a cruel calculation. "So," Julian said slowly, "you are telling me that the great Auguste was a fraud for his final year, and that you cooked the books to hide his disability?" "I protected him," Elias said, his voice shaking. Julian smiled, a cold, sharp expression that made my stomach turn. "That is a touching story. But here is the reality. If you quit, I will file charges for embezzlement. I will ruin your pension. I will make sure every restaurant in the city knows you stole from a dying man. Or I can release the story that Auguste was incompetent and you were his accomplice in defrauding our customers. Either way, your legacy is ash." Elias looked at me, his eyes pleading for help. I opened my mouth to speak, to scream that this was monstrous, but the words died in my throat. If I spoke now, if I admitted I knew, Julian would have leverage over me too. He would declare me incompetent for allowing the funds to be misused. He would take the power of attorney I still held over the estate. I had to remain a statue. I had to let Elias bear this weight alone for just a little longer. The guilt tasted like bile. "What do you want?" Elias asked, his voice broken. Julian tapped the folder. "The Future of Food Gala is on the 15th of November. You will stand on that stage. You will introduce the AI menu, and you will tell the investors that it creates dishes superior to your own. You will validate the machine, Elias, and in exchange, this folder stays in my safe." Elias looked down at his hands, the hands that had peeled 1,000 potatoes and boned 1,000 ducks for this family. He looked at me one last time, waiting for me to save him. I looked down at the invoice on the desk, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I said nothing. "Fine," Elias whispered. "I will do it." "Good choice," Julian said. He picked up the folder and walked to the door. "Make sure the calibration is finished by tomorrow. We cannot have any errors." When the door closed, Elias did not look at me. He picked up his apron and walked out of the office, leaving me alone with the ghost of my husband and the terrible silence of my own survival. The weeks that followed the ultimatum transformed the kitchen into something I no longer recognized. It was not a renovation. It was an autopsy. Julian brought in teams of technicians who wore blue shoe covers and carried tablets instead of knives. They did not care about the smell of roasting garlic or the caramelization of onions. They cared about data points, efficiency, and yield. Elias moved through the space like a man serving a prison sentence. The copper pots that Auguste had polished every morning were removed, replaced by rows of industrial immersion circulators. The stove remained cold for hours at a time. Instead of the roar of the flame and the hiss of searing meat, there was only the low, constant hum of water baths and the beep of digital timers. I sat on my usual stool in the corner, clutching my purse to my chest, invisible to the young programmers who adjusted the algorithms. I watched as they reduced my husband's lifework to a series of temperature curves. I felt like an intruder in the place where I had spent 40 years of my life. Julian called it precision. He stood in the center of the room, explaining to a group of investors that human error was the enemy of profit. He told them that a chef's mood could ruin a sauce, but the algorithm never had a bad day. He pointed to Elias, who was sealing duck breasts into plastic bags, and introduced him not as the head chef, but as a legacy operator. It broke my heart to see Elias reduced to pushing buttons. He did not taste anything anymore. There was no point. The machine dictated the seasoning down to the microgram. If the screen said the sauce needed 2 grams of salt, Elias added 2 grams of salt, even if his instinct screamed for 3. The kitchen was efficient, spotless, and dead. One afternoon, 3 days before the 15th of November, I found Elias staring at a readout on one of the monitors. The kitchen was empty of technicians for the moment, leaving us in a sterile silence that felt colder than the walk-in freezer. "Look at this," Elias said softly, without turning around. I walked over, my heels clicking loudly on the spotless floor. The screen displayed a complex web of lines and nodes, a digital map of flavor profiles. "It is analyzing the menus from the last 12 months, Elias said. "It is building the baseline for the master profile based on what Auguste served in his final year." I looked at the screen, and then I looked at Elias. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The last 12 months were the months when Auguste could not smell. They were the months when Elias had been frantically adjusting, overcompensating, and guessing to hide my husband's disability. "The machine thinks it is learning the secrets of a genius," Elias whispered. "But it is modeling the recipes of a ghost. It is optimizing for a man who could not taste his own food. It is learning the hesitation, the fear, and the silence of his sickness. And it calls it a style." "Julian does not know," I said. "No," Elias replied. "He thinks he is capturing the soul of Auguste. He is actually capturing the void." We stood there for a long moment, looking at the glowing lie on the screen. It was a terrible, perfect irony. Julian was so obsessed with removing the messy human element that he was unknowingly mass-producing the very flaw he despised. He was automating a tragedy. The AI was not preserving Auguste. It was preserving the secret we had fought so hard to hide. "Do not tell him," Elias said, turning to face me. His eyes were dull, the fire in them extinguished. "Let him present this to the world. Let him stand on that stage and sell his father's disability as the future of fine dining. It is the only justice we have left." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I wanted to apologize to Elias for my silence in the office, for letting Julian use him as a puppet to save my own position. But apologies were useless now. We were both trapped in the machinery, waiting for the gala to grind us down. The back door opened, and Julian strode in, checking his watch. "The beta test is over," Julian announced. "Pack up the samples. We need to focus on the presentation for the 15th. Elias, make sure your suit is pressed. You are the face of the revolution." Elias took off his apron, folding it with slow, deliberate movements. He looked like a man preparing for his own execution. I watched him leave, and I knew that whatever happened on the stage, the Auguste we loved was already gone, replaced by a code that knew everything about chemistry and nothing about the soul. It was 2 a.m. on the 12th of November when I heard the heavy creak of the floorboards outside my bedroom door. I had not slept well since the kitchen test, my mind replaying the image of that cold, digital graph pretending to be my husband. I tightened my robe and opened the door to find Elias standing in the hallway. He looked ghostly in the dim light, his face pale and his hands clutching 3 leather-bound notebooks against his chest. These were the original journals. Julian kept them locked in a glass display case in the library now, treating them like holy relics that were too valuable to be touched. "I stole them," Elias whispered, answering the question in my eyes. The lock was simple. "Julian thinks money buys security, but he bought a cheap mechanism." "Come inside," I said, ushering him into my room away from the hallway where the sound might travel to the master suite. Elias sat on the edge of my reading chair and opened the journal from the final year. The leather was cracked, stained with oil and sauce from nights of desperate work. He flipped to a page dated the 3rd of October. It was a recipe for a venison reduction, a dish that had become famous in our restaurant for its aggressive, almost jarring use of bitter chocolate and cayenne. "Look at the scan reports I printed from the lab," Elias said, handing me a sheet of paper. I read the AI's analysis. It described the combination as a bold deconstruction of sweetness, a daring avant-garde move to challenge the palate. It praised the genius of contrasting high bitterness with gamey meat. "Now look at the book," Elias said, pointing a trembling finger at the bottom corner of the page. I put on my reading glasses and leaned in. The handwriting was erratic, unlike Augusta's usual elegant script. In the margins, written so faintly that a scanner focused on ingredients would miss it, were scribbles of pure panic. "I cannot taste the chocolate," the note read. "Added more. Still nothing. Is it burning? God help me. Is it burning?" I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The AI had interpreted the heavy hand of a man who could not taste his own ingredients as a deliberate, stylistic choice. It saw the excessive cayenne not as a desperate attempt to feel some sensation on a numb tongue, but as a calculated stroke of brilliance. "Turn the page," Elias urged. I turned to the recipe for the scallop mousse. The AI called the texture essential minimalism. The journal entry was a cry of defeat. "Texture is all I have left. If I make it smooth, maybe they will not notice the lack of salt. I am terrified." "The machine missed the marginalia," Elias said, his voice cracking. It ignored the scribbles where he noted his frustration and fear. It took the random, panicked additions caused by his disability and codified them. "Julian is about to launch an entire franchise based on the symptoms of a stroke. He is selling his father's medical tragedy and calling it style." I closed the book, feeling sick. The brilliance Julian was so proud of, the legacy algorithm he was going to unveil to the investors, was nothing more than a digital map of Auguste's decline. We were not bottling his talent. We were bottling his confusion. "He cannot know," I said, the realization settling over me like a heavy shroud. "If we tell Julian now, he will think we are trying to sabotage him out of jealousy. He will not believe that his father was flawed. He needs the myth too much." Elias took the books back, his hands gentle. "So we let him do it?" Elias asked. "We let him serve this?" "We have no choice," I replied, though the decision tasted like ash. If we speak, we are the villains who hid the truth about his father's health. If we stay silent, the world eats the food of a suffering man. But perhaps that is the only way the truth comes out. Not by our word, but by the taste of the failure itself. Elias stood up to leave, clutching the journals that held the sad, human truth of my husband's final days. "Put them back," I said. "Wipe the glass. Make sure he never knows you touched them." I watched him leave, and for the first time, I realized that my silence was no longer just a shield. It was a weapon, and I was terrified of what it was about to destroy. The 15th of November was approaching, and we were walking toward a cliff edge that only Elias and I could see. The 15th of November arrived with a biting chill that rattled the window panes of the Skylight Hall. This was the venue Julian had chosen for the launch, a glass box overlooking the city skyline, stripped of all warmth and intimacy. It looked less like a dining room and more like an operating theater. I arrived early, dressed in a charcoal silk gown that felt like armor. The room was already buzzing with the elite of the culinary and tech worlds. There were venture capitalists in hoodies and blazers, food critics with their notebooks poised like knives, and influencers live streaming the decor. Giant screens projected my husband's face in high definition, looping a slow-motion video of him chopping chives from 30 years ago. It felt exploitative, as if they had dug him up to perform tricks. Julian found me near the entrance. He looked manic, his eyes bright with adrenaline and lack of sleep. "Mother, you look adequate," he said, kissing the air beside my cheek. "Just remember, when the cameras turn to you, try to look overwhelmed by the genius of it all. Tears would be good. It sells the narrative of the grieving widow finding solace in technology." I smoothed the fabric of my dress. "I will do what is appropriate, Julian." He did not hear me. He was already signaling to the lighting crew. The lights dimmed, bathing the room in a sterile blue glow. Julian took the stage, a microphone in hand, pacing back and forth like a preacher of a new religion. "Tonight, we do not just eat," Julian announced, his voice booming through the surround sound speakers. "Tonight, we upload history." For years, people thought the genius of Auguste Leclerc died with him. But I have proven that the soul is just data. We have fed his journals, his notes, and his very essence into the legacy algorithm. Tonight, you will taste immortality. The crowd applauded politely, but I saw the critics exchanging skeptical glances. They were here for the spectacle, not the sentiment. Then came the part I had been dreading. "And to oversee this transition from analog to digital," Julian said, gesturing to the side of the stage. "The man who stood by my father's side, the keeper of the old flame, Elias Thorne." The spotlight hit Elias. He stood in a chef's white coat that was too stiff, too bright. It had the company logo stitched on the breast pocket, right where his heart was. He looked small and gray under the harsh lights. He blinked, offering a weak, confused wave to the applause. He was not a partner here. He was a prop, a vintage ornament placed on a titanium shelf to give it credibility. Julian ushered him off stage quickly, guiding him toward the kitchen doors. "Go check the plating, Elias," Julian whispered loudly enough for the front row to hear. "Make sure the machine is respecting the master's vision." I slipped away from my table and followed them to the service corridor. I needed to see him. I needed to know he was surviving this indignity. The kitchen was unrecognizable. There were no flames, no clattering of copper pans, no shouting. It was silent. A row of young cooks in latex gloves stood in front of tablets, using tweezers to arrange components that had been prepared hours ago in vacuum-sealed bags. A robotic arm dispensed sauces with mathematical precision. Elias stood in the corner, ignored by the young staff. He looked at the assembly line with hollow eyes. He reached into the deep pocket of his pristine white trousers and pulled out a small, folded cloth. He unwrapped it on a stainless steel prep table. Inside was a single tomato. It was an ugly thing, a black Krim heirloom from his own garden. It was lumpy, scarred with cat-facing marks, and slightly bruised on one side. It was not uniform. It was not perfect. But when he took a small paring knife and sliced into it, the smell hit me from 10 feet away. It smelled of wet earth, rain, and sunshine. It smelled of life. Elias looked up and saw me standing in the doorway. He did not smile. He simply cut a wedge of the tomato, sprinkled a pinch of coarse sea salt from his own pocket onto it, and ate it. He closed his eyes, grounding himself in the reality of flavor before the artificial storm began. He offered me a piece, silently. I took it. The acidity and sweetness exploded on my tongue, a stark contrast to the sterile air of the kitchen. It was a secret communion between us, a reminder of what food was supposed to be before it became code. The swinging doors opened and a server rushed in. "First course," the server shouted. The deconstructed mole. Elias watched the plates leave the kitchen. They carried the dark, bitter paste that the AI had created based on a sick man's inability to taste sweetness. "God forgive us," Elias whispered, wiping the tomato seeds from his lip. I touched his arm. "Stay here, Elias," I said. "Do not go out there. Let the silence do the work." I walked back into the dining room just as the plates were being set down. The room went quiet as the investors and critics picked up their spoons. Julian stood by the stage, a triumphant grin plastered on his face, waiting for the applause that the algorithm had promised him. I sat down, folded my hands in my lap, and watched my son's ambition collide with the reality of a bruised and broken palate. The silence that followed the first course was not the reverent kind Julian had advertised in his pitch deck. It was the polite, confused silence of people trying to understand why their soup tasted like burnt cocoa and regret. I saw the lead investor, a woman named Mrs. Galloway, who controlled the pension funds for half the state, quietly reach for her water glass to rinse the taste away. Julian was already sweating, his hands gripping the podium as he launched into a frantic explanation about the algorithm's bold choices regarding bitterness profiles. Then came the main event. The kitchen doors swung open again, but this time the rhythm was different. The waitstaff did not rush. They marched with the solemnity of a religious procession. They carried large, rimless plates that held the centerpiece of the evening, the synthesized beef bourguignon. From my seat, I could see the food before it reached the tables. It was terrifyingly perfect. The meat was a geometric cube, glistening with a sauce so smooth it looked like dark glass. The pearl onions were identical spheres, positioned at exact 45-degree angles from the meat. The carrots were not cut. They were printed into uniform orange batons. It did not look like dinner. It looked like a rendering on a computer screen, devoid of accidents, devoid of humanity. I looked toward the service station near the kitchen entry. Julian was too busy watching the investors to notice what was happening behind him. Elias had stepped out of the shadows. He stood at the pass, that critical border between the heat of the kitchen and the cool air of the dining room. As the waiters lined up with the plates destined for the head table, Elias raised a hand. He did not shout. He did not cause a scene. He possessed the quiet, undeniable authority of a man who had fed this city for 40 years. The waiters froze. They knew who the real chef was, regardless of whose name was on the digital sign outside. Elias reached into the pocket of his trousers and retrieved the remaining half of the black crimped tomato. It was weeping juice onto his fingers, a messy, organic reality in a room sanitized of all errors. With his other hand, he took a small silver knife from the nearest tray. He moved down the line of plates intended for Mrs. Galloway and her associates. Slice. Plop. He dropped a jagged, bleeding wedge of raw tomato right next to the perfect, synthetic beef cube. It ruined the symmetry instantly. The red juice ran into the glossy brown sauce, breaking the surface tension, creating an oil-slick pattern that looked chaotic and unrehearsed. The tomato slice was lumpy and dark, its skin scarred. It looked violent next to the sterile perfection of the AI-generated meat. Julian's head waiter, a young man named Marcus, looked at Elias with wide eyes, trembling slightly as he held the tray. "Tell them," Elias whispered, his voice low and gravelly. "Tell them it is the chef's final, unpublished instruction. Tell them the machine cannot understand the necessity of acid without the chaos of the soil." Marcus nodded. He signaled the team. The procession resumed. I watched Julian's face as the plates were set down in front of the investors. His smile faltered. He blinked, leaning forward, trying to understand why there was a piece of garbage on his masterpiece. He looked frantically toward the kitchen, but Elias was gone, having retreated back into the steam and darkness. Mrs. Galloway looked down at her plate. She adjusted her glasses. She looked at the perfect cube of meat, and then she looked at the ugly, weeping tomato slice. "This was not in the brochure," she said, her voice carrying over the low hum of the room. Marcus leaned in, reciting the line Elias had given him. "It is the unpublished instruction, ma'am. A contrast of textures." She picked up her fork. The room seemed to hold its breath. Julian looked as if he might faint. He made a move to step off the stage, perhaps to snatch the plate away, but it was too late. Mrs. Galloway ignored the beef entirely. She speared the tomato slice. She put it in her mouth and chewed. I saw her shoulders drop. The tension that had been building in her jaw since the bitter soup arrived suddenly vanished. She closed her eyes. It was a reaction I had seen 1,000 times at our old restaurant, a reaction to something real, something grown in the dirt under the sun, not compiled in a server room. She swallowed and opened her eyes, looking directly at Julian. "Finally," she said, cutting through the silence. "Something that tastes like it came from the earth." Then she cut a piece of the synthetic beef and ate it with the remaining tomato juice. She chewed slowly, her expression turning thoughtful, then critical. The tomato had not saved the dish. It had done something far more dangerous. By being so vividly, aggressively real, it had exposed the beef for what it truly was: a soft, flavorless sponge masquerading as food. The contrast was brutal. The tomato made the expensive, high-tech main course taste like wet cardboard. Julian stood frozen on stage, his hands shaking at his sides. He watched as the other investors followed Mrs. Galloway's lead, eating the tomato first, their faces lighting up with relief, only to fall into disappointment when they moved to the meat. I picked up my own fork, looking at the plate that had been set before me. I did not need to taste it to know the truth. Elias had not poisoned the meal. He had simply turned on the lights, and the glare was unforgiving. Julian stepped down from the stage, his movements stiff and mechanical. He looked like a marionette whose strings had been pulled too tight. He approached Mrs. Galloway's table, his hands clasped so firmly behind his back that his knuckles must have been white. He tried to laugh, a hollow sound that bounced awkwardly off the high ceilings. "It is a bold pairing," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "We wanted to challenge the palate, to show how the purity of the protein creates a canvas for the organic chaos of the vegetable." Mrs. Galloway did not look up at him. She was busy pushing the cube of synthetic beef to the edge of her plate, treating it like an unwanted garnish. She looked at the empty spot where the tomato had been, a small pool of seeds and juice remaining. "It is not a canvas, Julian," she said, her tone flat and professional. "It is a vacancy. The vegetable highlights what is missing from your creation, not what is present." She looked around the table. The other investors had stopped eating. The excitement that had filled the room only 10 minutes ago had evaporated, replaced by the awkward politeness of people who realize they have been sold a lie. The beef was safe. It was sustainable. It was efficient. But it was not food. It was fuel, devoid of the memory of rain or soil or struggle. Julian turned to me. His eyes were wide, panic finally breaking through his arrogant mask. For a moment, he looked like the little boy who had dropped a carton of eggs in the driveway in 1992, terrified of the mess he had made. But I could not fix this for him. I could not grab a rag and wipe away the humiliation. He had built this stage, and now he had to stand on it. I stood up slowly, smoothing the fabric of my skirt. I did not speak to the investors. I did not need to vindicate myself or explain that my recipes were not just data points to be fed into a processor. The silence in the room did the work for me. Julian stepped into my path as I moved toward the kitchen doors. His face was flushed. "You planned this," he hissed, his voice low so the others would not hear. "You and that old relic in the kitchen, you sabotaged me." I looked at him, feeling a deep, aching sadness in my chest. It was not the triumph of victory. It was the grief of realizing that my son was no longer a person who understood the value of labor or truth. He was a man who thought shortcuts were innovations. "We did not change a thing, Julian," I said softly. "We simply served what was real alongside what was not. You were the one who was afraid of the comparison." I walked past him. He did not try to stop me again. In the kitchen, Elias was packing his knife roll. He looked tired, the deep lines of his face accentuated by the harsh fluorescent lights. He did not smile when he saw me. He just nodded. We walked out the back door, leaving the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the dining room behind us. The night air was cool and smelled of damp asphalt and distant rain. It was a relief to breathe it in. We walked to my old sedan, the silence between us comfortable and familiar. As I started the engine, I looked back at the glowing windows of the restaurant. I could see silhouettes moving, hands gesturing. The deal was likely falling apart, or perhaps it would morph into something less glamorous. Julian would probably sell his technology to a fast food chain or a cafeteria supplier. He would make money, certainly, but he would never be the visionary artist he claimed to be. He would just be a manufacturer of filler. That was his punishment. He wanted to be a chef, but he had proven only that he was a factory manager. I pulled out onto the main road, the headlights cutting through the dark. I thought about the garden behind my small house. I thought about the rows of beans that needed watering and the soil that needed turning. Tomorrow, I would wake up early. I would put on my gloves. I would work until my back ached and my hands were stained with dirt. There was no glory in it. There were no investors to applaud me. But when I sat down to eat, I would taste the sun and the rain and the months of patience. Elias looked out the window, watching the city lights fade as we drove toward the suburbs. "The tomato was good," he said, breaking the silence. "Yes," I replied, keeping my eyes on the road. It was. We did not speak of Julian again. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in months I felt like I was driving in the right direction. The noise was behind me. Ahead, there was only the quiet, honest work of living.